Hi everyone, I'm Péter Krekó, Director of Political Capital Institute and also Europe's Futures Fellow at the IWM and Erste Foundation. I'm at Budapest right now and it's quite an honor to be able to talk to you at this highly prestigious event. I'm going to talk about Hungary and tell a story about Hungary and its pandemic power grab. Hungary is a NATO and EU member, but it follows a remarkable illiberal path in the last years. This is a story of a country where the pandemic found the healthcare sector totally unprepared. Not the only case, let's be honest. Viktor Orbán's government reduced its spending on the healthcare sector and preferred spending huge amounts of money on sports stadiums and other luxurious expenditures instead. As a consequence, healthcare became the primary concerns of citizens in Hungary, much more than in UK, France, Germany, or Italy. Voters were interested in this issue. Healthcare became the political Achilles heel of the government, one of the fields where people regarded it as highly unsuccessful. 42% of Hungarians mentioned healthcare among the most important problems. Two favorite topics of the government in the last years, immigration and terrorism, are only important for 16 and 7% of the voters. So this is not a perfect starting point for a virus. This is not surprising that when the pandemic hit Europe, Orbán was still highly reluctant to talk about it. Even at the end of February, Orbán said almost nothing about the coronavirus and preferred to talk about his favorite subject, immigration, that brought him popularity in the past. The pandemic left Hungary totally unprepared, with an unprepared political class and an unprepared healthcare sector. Orbán was so obsessed with immigration that when the coronavirus then hit the country, he just used it as another occasion to talk about immigration. As soon as the coronavirus hit the country, the government quickly laid blame on Muslim immigrants, combining the two main evils, coronavirus and illegal immigration, Muslim immigration. Governmental people pushed the message that there is a clear connection between the coronavirus and illegal immigration. Politicians added that the most arrivals of the illegal migrants are from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. Most of them are from or passed through one of the main centers of epidemic. Which country, you guess, have not been mentioned by any governmental people? China. So China did not appear in the governmental communication as one of the sources of the virus. The first publicly announced cases of coronavirus were of Iranian students, with the Hungarian government, responsible authorities and Fidesz loudly blaming them for the lack of cooperation during the quarantine. A message that deliberately aimed to strengthen the association between the coronavirus and Muslim immigration. As you can see on the left, on the Facebook, this message was pushed in a highly concentrated manner, while other authorities were rather busy of telling people that please wash hands and go into social distancing. The main message of the Hungarian government was that Iranian students are to blame for the coronavirus. This message will totally absurd. The Iranians who tested positive in Hungary were not illegal immigrants, but students studying in Hungary with the Hungarian state-supported fellowship program. But beyond that, how could an epidemic spreading throughout the world's elites, following flight routes, infecting officials such as the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the spokesperson of the Brazilian president, or even Tom Hanks, be blamed on illegal migrants? If coronavirus is connected to anything, then it's much more illegal, it's much more international trade and much more international tourism than illegal migration. But the government clearly failed to tackle the virus policy-wise. With one of the lowest ratio of testing within the European Union, Orbán quickly realized the opportunity in the coronavirus to cement his economic and political power. The Hungarian parliament, where Orbán has a two-thirds majority, passed the bill on 30th of March that extended his powers. The law, the Enabling Act, gives parliamentary authorization to prolong the state of emergency in light of the coronavirus pandemic, and the government can rule by decree with hardly any legal supervision. No by-elections can be held, no rallies can be held, and there is no sunset clause in the text, which means that it will remain in place, the state of emergency will remain in place as long as the government wants. Neither the Constitutional Court nor the Parliament, the two bodies that could officially supervise the decisions of the government, can serve as real checks and balances. Why? For the simple reason that they have zero independence and they are full of governmental loyalists. This way, the governmental power became almost unlimited without constitutional check and without political check. Hungary has become a textbook case of how coronavirus can be abused for authoritarian ends. Orbán knows that when death is in the air and when politics is about life and death, people tend to rally around the flag, as it happens at most of the Western countries, and their attention is narrow. They care much less about human rights and rule of law issues, both domestically, both internationally. Orbán also uses and abuses this opportunity to silence the critical press. Changes to the criminal code have been made so that now the publication of hoaxes, disinformation, and false facts or distorted facts that interfere with the successful protection of the public from the coronavirus could be punished by up to 5 years in prison. And this is a clear message to journalists. The wording of the law is so vague that it can be easily used against journalists. And if this message in itself was not clear enough, governmental propagandists and the public media makes it blatantly obvious. They are busy with listing critical coverage of governmental action, and journalists who are critical towards the governmental treatment of the virus as fake news pieces around the coronavirus and calling for authorities even to arrest journalists. Just by accident, we could see a very similar legislation passed in Vladimir Putin's Russia as well, that also can lead to 5 years in prison for spreading false coronavirus news. Great minds think alike. But while the government is officially fighting against fake news, it is spreading state-sponsored disinformation on an industrial level. Typical fake news narratives that have been pushed in the pro-governmental media, which is a huge media empire. First of all, they say EU doesn't help anything, while Hungary received 5.6 billion euros to help protect itself from the pandemic. Members of the government say that EU is doing nothing but just lecturing Hungary about democracy. Orbán also claims that EU unable is help now, unlike China and members of the Turkic Council, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, for whom we are greatly grateful for. Also, Turkey, Russia, and China are handling the crisis way better, according to governmental propaganda, than liberal democracies. This is quite absurd, because how would they know? In a dictatorship with no freedom of the press like China or Turkey, you cannot publish without consequences. We clearly cannot see how big is the crisis, and don't forget that the pandemic originates from China. Orbán's disinformation machinery is suggesting that authoritarianism is a better way than liberal democracy, both generally, but both in this specific case, tackling the crisis. This is one reason why the West should really care. Orbán does its best to destroy the image of the Western alliances, EU and NATO, that he is a member of. The second reason is that the government right now wants to take over companies. We should prepare for an era where nationalizations, reprivatizations will be obviously options on the table. The government is currently deploying a military task force to oversee the operation of 140 companies that provide critical services, for example, in the energy or the retail sector, and both in the public and the private sectors. Multinational companies will likely face levies as they have done before, but this time without any meaningful legal obstacles, and in a country where the rule of law is in serious trouble. There, I think investors have good reasons to be a bit worried. The EU funds will most likely be redirected to the line of pockets of pro-governmental cronies in a breathless amount of corruption. And a third reason to be afraid. Hungary became one of the weakest points in Western alliances regarding its immunity towards China. Not only the rhetoric that is alarming, but the Chinese Communist Party is practically buying right now the Hungarian political elite via €5 billion giga project, a totally unnecessarily railway connection line between Budapest and Belgrade, while there is already an existing railway line. This is supported by Chinese loans, but by the end of the day, paid by Hungarian taxpayers. And among the beneficiaries of this project, we can find Orbán's pet moneyman, but at the same time, we can find Chinese companies as well, such as the tech giant Huawei. So Hungarian pro-governmental businessmen and Chinese business interests will have a very good project, but it's not totally obvious why and how it serves the Hungarian people. And the fourth important reason, and the last one, while Hungary needs attention, is that Orbán is a role model for other illiberal leaders within the more or less democratic world. We can already see that within the European Union and outside the European Union. For example, in Poland and in Serbia, Orbán is regarded to be one of the role models. And while he is not the most dangerous autocrat in the world, he is among the most dangerous autocrats within the Western world. If his experiment of pandemic power grab proves successful, many other democratically elected leaders will be encouraged to follow his path. And if Hungary is not put into a political quarantine, new wave of illiberalism will sweep through Europe, especially in the East, and it can destroy the Western alliances from within. Already the critical voices targeting Hungary in the last weeks mattered a lot in keeping the Hungarian government at bay, and my message would be that please keep attention to Hungary, and politicians, NGOs, journalists, everyone should raise their voices when they see problematic tendencies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. We're here to discuss authoritarianism in the time of pandemics, and you've just heard the very brilliant Péter Krekó giving you a report from Budapest. We have Péter with us. We also have Garry Kasparov, known to many of you as one of the world's greatest chess players ever, but also a really important Russian human rights activist who is also deeply connected to the Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm Anne Applebaum. I'm a writer for The Atlantic. I'm also a historian. I've written books about Soviet history and about authoritarians who try and grab power. And I have to say, one of the first things I did when the news of the pandemic broke out was I looked up what happened in the past, and there is a very, very long tradition of, going back to the Middle Ages, of rulers taking power, taking people's freedom away at times of pandemic when people are frightened. And of course, in those times, people are willing to give up their freedom because they're scared, and they think they'll trade their freedom for security, and they'll be, and they'll be able to stay safe. Obviously, in the modern world, the big division in front of us is not between autocracies and democracies in terms of who's fighting this plague better. It's between countries that are competent and incompetent. Nevertheless, we see, a few leaders, starting with Orbán in Europe, and we'll talk about a few others, who are using this as an opportunity to accrue power for themselves. But I thought I would start first by asking Péter, one of the things that a couple of people have said to me about Hungary is that what Orbán has done hasn't changed that much. In other words, the situation was had disintegrated and deteriorated so much, and there's so few checks and balances on him already. The question is, does what he's done in the last few days, will it really make any difference?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anne, for the question. And yeah, it's a really huge honor to be here. I got used to that I react on articles and presentations of you and Garry Kasparov, and not the other way around. So it's really strange for me. Coming back to your question, yeah, from one hand, I think it's totally right. Orbán already had a superpower, a supermajority in the Hungarian parliament, which means that they can change even the constitution, and they did that since 2018. They created a new constitution. They said it was carved in stone, and then they changed it at least 8 times so far, and there will be many others possibly. So they already had quite strong powers. What changed right now as a result of passing these emergency laws is, first of all, there can be no rallies held, there can be no by-election, via which they could lose their supermajority at the moment. Second, they cannot, as you said, the voters are focusing on something totally different right now. When life and death is the question, then who cares about corruption? Who really cares about rule of law? So in this situation, practically, and the third thing is the government makes the show, so they can be on air all the time, and nobody is really interested about what the opposition is doing. So right now, Orbán really has a huge opportunity to even cement more his political power and his economic power as well. And all the steps that they have done were at least as much about reducing transparency and making it possible for oligarchs to take away even more from the public finances, including the EU funds, than about cementing political power.
Yeah, it seemed to me when I saw what Orbán was doing, it seemed to me pretty clear that what he was trying to do was set up a situation whereby anybody who was against him or who opposed him was somehow pro-virus. And I even heard some of that language being used in the opposition, against the opposition. And I actually wanted to ask Garry, is this a technique you're going to see in Russia? Do you foresee it happening in other places? People in power say, we're defending the nation against the virus. Anybody who opposes us or criticizes us is pro-virus, is trying to make you sick.
Yeah, you're right. And authoritarian regimes, they never let a good crisis to be wasted. And of course, it's like a welcome opportunity to grab even more power, pretending that they care about human lives. In Russia, the situation is slightly different because somehow coronavirus stood in the way of Putin's big plans for this spring. He also introduced changes to the constitution, by the way, absolutely illegally. He didn't even follow the process that is clearly written in constitution. He didn't bother because he expected to run a showdown on April 22nd. They didn't bother to call a referendum. They knew it was not a referendum by Russian law, so they call it. So it's the people's day of vote. But he had to cancel it, and also he planned to have a big event on May the 9th. That's Stalin's interpretation of D-Day, because as we know that Germany capitulated on May 8th, but Stalin didn't like it, so he wanted a separate day. So the second capitulation, and that's why Soviet Union always celebrated May the 9th. And Putin planned a big military parade, expecting leaders of the free world to show up. Unfortunately, many of them accepted originally, and that would be like a seal of approval from the free world for his newly acquired powers, basically accepting him as a ruler for life. It has not been cancelled yet, the May parade, but it seems that it's not going to happen. So Putin seems to me, from listening to what he had to say, if not in panic, but definitely he lost his usual confidence. He already spoke 4 times on the issue, moving from we didn't care, it's all fine. Russia is just not being under any threat, to the latest yesterday that Russia is not doing fine, and we are expecting even probably the situation to get worse. But at the same time, we could see as the governors, with the Kremlin's approval, they are basically imposing the martial law in the regions without even imposing it legally. So we could see how there's more power is being gathered, and even in Moscow now, people have to be registered to walk on the streets. So no doubt that the end of this pandemic will leave authoritarian regimes with more power in their hands. And we know that's a joke in the Soviet Union that nothing is more permanent than the temporary measures. And naturally, they'll try to keep them in place in inventing new threats. But still, I would say that in Russia so far, regime is not doing as well as other authoritarian regimes. Another reason is dramatic drop in oil prices. And oil prices were always, it was a staple for Putin's stability, because it generated enough cash to buy social apathy and keep population quiet. Now with oil prices drop down and Russian treasury being not yet depleted, but definitely having greatest financial challenge ever, so Putin may find it's more difficult than before to extend his rule across the land.
Yeah, I was even wondering if there could be a kind of later on a kind of backlash, in following the pandemic. In other words, you have, Hungary, you have, in a number of places in China, a number of other countries, you will have authoritarians trying to use this moment of crisis to crack down, to, their opposition as being pro-virus, all those things. But isn't it also possible that later on down the line, in 2 months and 3 months and 6 months, particularly following economic crash, and also as people get tired of the constraints on them, isn't there a possibility that this situation could go the other way, and that the counter reaction against authoritarianism could actually grow out of this crisis? I'd be interested in what both of you think.
Peter, yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Okay, just very quickly, I think this is something fundamental, and it's very interesting to see that how voters all around the Western world, where we can more or less trust the public opinion polls, are just rallying around the flag. So we don't just see it at authoritarian regimes, but in the democratic world as well, that even leaders who realized the problem very late and were responding it bad are right now doing well on the public opinion polls. But I think it's really something temporary. When the direct threat of life will be over and leaders have to muddle through a brutal economic breakdown and recession, I think everyone in power will suffer, which I think will mean that authoritarians will face hard time, but Democrats on power will face hard time as well, because this is not something that will be very easy to handle.
Garry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, Anne, you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation two key words: competence versus incompetence. And I think that's the way people will judge the performance of two systems. That's why it's so important for us to lay down all the facts. As yesterday, at the first day of COVIDCon, people talked about the origin of pandemics and the fault. Actually, it's not just negligence, but it's real fault and guilt of Chinese Communist Party for trying to cover it up. So it's very important to understand that the authoritarian regimes, they are much slower in responding to any threat, because they want to look perfect. They cannot accept any criticism. They cannot accept any wrongdoings. And that's why, it's all the stories about China being more effective in dealing with coronavirus. It's still a big question mark. As we learned yesterday from the first day of COVIDCon, they were covering it up. They most likely were behind the research in the lab that was the real origin of pandemics. But also now they banned all the information, all the exchange of the information. So that's why when you hear from the authoritarian regimes, let's fight together. but it doesn't mean they want to fight together. It just, they use it for the advantages, like China is pushing Taiwan out, so that they don't want a World Health Organization to get any data from Taiwan. And also, it's amazing that when you look at the data received from around the world, China is the only country that is missing a very vital piece of data: how many tests they have conducted. You cannot find it online. And also, it's about the ultimate response, vaccination and the treatment. And it seems to me that the free world will be far more effective in responding, because we can have people working in the labs, in garage. They don't need, that's the state-sponsored institutions. So I think there's a very good chance that as a result of this crisis, people in the free world will recognize that the open market, the liberal democracies, they offer more opportunities to respond to the crisis, and also to do everything to prevent the next crisis. Because we can learn from our experience, and we can actually operate with the wisdom of the crowd, with democracy that allows different groups to criticize each other, while the authoritarian regimes, they're trying to stifle all the protest, all the dissent, and that's why it's more difficult for them to be prepared for the next crisis, and they will never change their behavior of pretending that they were infallible.
Yeah, it's been really striking for me that how, a lot of the people's first reaction was, oh, look, the Chinese have controlled it. And nobody noticed that actually the Taiwanese have done spectacularly well. And the South Koreans have done spectacular. These are very active, loud democracies. But they're democracies that have competent civil service. There are democracies where people have a lot of trust in the system, and they were willing to participate in even some kinds of surveillance. And they were willing to, temporarily give up, privacy, some elements of privacy, in order to know how close they'd been to people who'd been infected and so on. And it seems to me much more likely that those kinds of techniques eventually will work in the Western world as well. I mean, the one country that I am worried about from this point of view actually is the United States. I'm worried that the deep political divisions, the partisanship, and in particular the influence of the kind of Fox News world media, with its constant obsession with conspiracy theories and constantly seeking to undermine the scientific establishment, will make solving some of the problems more difficult in the U.S. I don't know what the two of you think about that.
Peter.
Okay, thank you. What I find very interesting is that, for example, in Hungary, the mindset of many pro-governmental voters, as far as we can judge based on the very few research that has been done, so it changed quite dramatically from one moment to another. So when fans of Viktor Orbán and Fidesz voters, the governmental voters, first heard from many sources that it's not really a thing, it's something as a hoax, it's not so serious, migration is more important, then of course, they didn't really take it seriously. But a few weeks after that, when the official message was that it's deadly serious and you have to take it serious, then they changed their minds. So in a bizarre manner, authoritarian leaders sometimes have this kind of power to sweep the attitudes of their voters very quickly. Still, what I find generally as a huge problem, I totally agree with both of you that the democratic world is much more competent in generally handling the crisis. Right now, the perception, I think, is totally different in most parts of the world. The perception is that Russia and China is out to help other countries because they are just treating it wonderfully, and they can provide others equipment, they can provide others help and food and everything. And even if it's totally against facts, I do think that this perception will prevail, and I'm pretty afraid that finally it will be a big sharp power win for the authoritarian powers, because they underreport the numbers. They show up a totally fake image on how they treated the crisis, but there is a receptive audience to that in the West.
Garry, what do you think?
Yeah, look, you pointed out that America, and you're absolutely right, because it's not just ordinary year, election year, and these elections could have an impact for American political system, because as I said many times, re-electing Donald Trump would exonerate his political practice, which is from being democratic. And every day we could see him ranting some nonsense and attacking free media. Things are getting worse and worse. But it's and faithful followers, brainwashed by Fox News and the party, the Republican Party, that is willing to do whatever to stay on top. And it's not easy, because it's now the crisis, people used to rally on the flag. Though it's amazing that Trump's approval rating never crossed 50%. So a few years ago, I founded Renew Democracy Initiative, and Anne also is a member of the board of the organization. And we're trying to actually to bring sense back to American politics, not to politicize these issues. I mean, not to let people use any crisis, especially this one, as an opportunity to push their political agenda. I recorded recently a video with Dr. Celine Gander, so she's expert often on CNN, talking about authoritarianism and pandemics. And who could have believed that in America, in the United States of America, we'll be dealing with the fact that the president will be using his office to push his own agenda at the time of the crisis. We recently saw the announcement about a committee to open America, and it's a mixture of family members and some of his closest advisors, his cronies, Trump's cronies, and not included governors or health experts or even professional, economists. So it's a challenging time. But again, it's up to the voters to make their decision. At least here in the United States, eventually, I hope in Hungary and in Poland. But it's very important for us to lay down the facts. And I think we should be absolutely open and clear about what's happened, and not try to write off all the facts if they come from the opposite side. Because if Trump says that China was guilty in spreading the virus, we cannot say no, everything Trump says is wrong. So we have to be open, and we have to be honest. We have to make bold statements, but at the same time, not to politicize that. That's a difference. We have to show that the only way to recover from this crisis and to stay democratic is to be open, and just not to renege on the democratic forms, and not to attack whatever my opponent said because he's my opponent just for this reason.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what worries me about Trump is the fact that some of what he does is very like what authoritarians do in other places, as you say, exactly, politicizing a crisis like this for his own personal and political goals, and just sort of, even using the distribution of aid to different states in a way that somehow he thinks is going to help.
Absolutely.
I also agree that the only solution to it is openness, continually moving back to the facts, trying to focus as much as possible on what's really happening on the ground, and kind of moving your way through the propaganda. I mean, it's the same really in every country.
But also, I think it's important for us to not to be hijacked by this false sense of fairness. If we criticize Trump 10 times, we should criticize Joe Biden 10 times. This is not about political balance. This is about facts. This is about truth, and this is the only way to fight back against fake news industry that unfortunately is thriving at the time of the crisis.
Yeah. I'm going to I have a whole list of questions in front of me, and I'm just going to bring up one of them. And really, actually, I'll say there are 3 or 4 questions which are really directly related to the EU and Hungary. In other words, can Hungary, now that Orbán has declared himself to be a de facto dictator, in fact, he can now issue decrees. He doesn't have to turn to parliament for anything. Can he remain inside international organizations? But of course, that's also a broader question, which is how does the community of democracies, which includes the United States, deal with members like Hungary? And we may have another case in Poland, and it's a little bit different situation here, but it may come up in a few more weeks. how should the international community deal with cases like this? What's the answer? Well, I'll start by asking Peter, what would you like the EU to do to start out with?
I think the EU, what is really lacking in the European Union generally to step up against Hungary, I don't think this is really the lack of the possibilities, the legal possibilities, what is the problem, but the lack of political will, and especially from the side of Germany. So mostly Orbán can also still be, and Fidesz, his party, can be the member of the European People's Party, because the Germans are quite reluctant to kick him out. And what is the rationale behind that, which I think is a bit similar to what we can see in the principled engagement policy of the State Department, is that it's better to have, let's say, a weak autocrat or a soft autocrat on your side than to give him to the enemy. But the thing is that there is no such thing as a committed Western autocrat. Many examples in Europe prove that. We can just remember Nikola Gruevski, for example. One of his first meetings was with the White House with George W. Bush, and then gradually from a pro-European, pro-American politician, he shifted to a more authoritarian, more pro-Russian position. And this is what we can see in the case of Hungary as well. I mean, as Orbán turns more authoritarian, it just opens the door more for malign Russian and Chinese influence. And that's the main reason why I think politicians, leaders of states in the European Council, but also party leaders within the European People's Party should put a higher pressure on him. And he wants to stay within the European Union because he knows that outside of the European Union, he would lose all his influence he has now towards the East. So still the EU has a huge leverage, much bigger than it really uses.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Garry?
I couldn't agree more with Peter. It's a problem that EU now looks more like United Nations now, where just everybody is admitted, and you just have to pay the lip service to the rules, to the Declaration of Human Rights. But United Europe was built on different principles. It was an idea of first common market and then liberal values, and now allowing Hungary to stay inside with without reprimanding it. For the actions that have been recently undertaken, it basically turns Hungary in the Russian Trojan horse. And I think it does much more damage inside Europe, because it also sends a message across that, it doesn't matter. So Europe is tasteless. It has no power. They're willing to do whatever for economic considerations. And I think this is our biggest weakness, because this is a typical narrative that is being distributed by Russians and Chinese and other authoritarian regimes, that it's all about economy. As long as we can have global trade, nobody cares what you do at home. No, we have to change it. We have to care what's happening in Russia, in China, because eventually it bites us on the back. It comes back with this sort of viruses or hybrid wars. But Hungary is inside Europe. And as Peter stated, European Union has so much leverage, and a failure to use it, a lack of political will, it creates more confusion among voters, and also it's like it's some form of slow dissolution of European Union as an organization, based not just on a common market ideas, but on shared liberal values.
Yes, no, I really agree. I mean, it could be, this is such a unique moment when people are so focused on themselves and their own problems that people aren't reacting to Hungary the way they should. It's not impossible, from little things I've picked up, that down the road, over the coming months, there will be, as Europe begins to put itself back together, there will be a reaction. Anyway, I hope there will. Thank you, Garry. Thank you, Peter. I'm told our time is up, and I know there are a lot of other great people for everybody to watch. Thanks, everybody, for coming in whatever time zone you're in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.